Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of ManCaveMorons Podcast. Hopefully, you all enjoyed your weekend. Today, we've got a couple topics to discuss. We're going to hop right in. The first being Yu Darvish signing a 6-year, $126 million deal with the Cubs. The free agent market in baseball has been a little soft this offseason. There's been a few big signings, but this was definitely a big splash. Darvish was rumored to be possibly going to the Yankees, a couple other teams, but the Cubs swoop in day before pitchers and catchers are supposed to be reporting. Actually, a couple days. The signing was over the weekend. Take on that, he's a 31-and-a-half-year-old pitcher. 6 years puts him out of 37. That's kind of long money. If their plan is win now, maybe it's a safe bet. But I envision the last 3 years of this deal are going to be awful for the Cubs. But if they're happy with immediate production, then it could be worth it for him. But again, this is a guy who, I know a lot of people like Darvish. He's a strikeout machine. He's one of these analytic guys, the new analytics. He's got a good whip and he's got a good WAR. But in 5 years, he's 56-42 with a 3.42 ERA. Those are not lights out numbers. He was 10-12 last year with a 3.86 ERA. To me, that's a lot of money to be given to a guy who is a average pitcher who strikes out a lot of people. I don't know if that was a good bet. But again, short term, it might work out well for them. This is also a guy, it'll be interesting to see how he pitches in Chicago. I didn't go back and look at his road stats in northern cities, but he's a guy, again, who's pitched in Texas and LA. Is he going to be able to pitch in Chicago in April? I don't know. Those are things we're going to have to monitor. And basically that means Arrieta's gone. The Cubs and Arrieta couldn't reach an agreement on anything. So for all intensive purposes, I think all that money going to Darvish is going to definitely eliminate Arrieta. Where Arrieta goes, hopefully we'll find out over the next couple of days as camp opens up. There was a rumor with the Nationals. But back to the Darvish thing, again, I think most teams are trying to stay away from the long-term deals with pitchers, especially pitchers who are in their 30s. If this was a 26-year-old Darvish, you might feel a little better about it. But a 31-and-a-half-year-old Darvish, you're thinking, geez, 37 for a guy who's only won 16 games or more once in his career, and that was his rookie season. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And, only time will tell. I'm not going to be a prognosticator here and say, oh, this guarantees the Cubs are going to win the Central. We're going to have to see how this unfolds. I don't like to make early season predictions on Major League Baseball just because I do think, you got those injuries, you got crazy things that happen in spring training. You really don't have a good feel until All-Star break of where some of these teams are. So Darvish, 6 years, I'm not a big fan of it. Clearly, there wasn't a lot of teams who were big fans of giving him 6 years because, like I said, the Yankees were rumored, and if there's a team that definitely needs, pitching help, it is the Yankees, and they decided to stay away from Darvish. So I don't know if it was a year's thing with him, money, what it was with the Yankees. I do know some of the bigger spenders are trying to stay under the luxury tax level, so maybe that was the deal with them, and it doesn't seem like there was a lot of suitors, and so the Cubs swoop in here and throw out a 6-year deal, and we'll see how it plays out, and we'll just have to monitor it this season. And like I said, long term, I think it's a bad deal. Short term, maybe that's a game changer for the Cubs, and it helps solidify their strength in the NL Central. But that's be seen, and we'll definitely keep monitoring that as the season goes on. In other Major League Baseball free agency news, it's been a soft market. It really has. There hasn't been a ton of big signings. Obviously we had the Stanton trade. We've had, I'm looking here at a list of, 5-6 big names that have been signed. We got Jay Bruce went back to the Mets on a 3-year, $39 million deal. Lorenzo Cain was a big deal, signing with the Brewers. They ponied up $80 million over 5. They liked what he did in Kansas City. Zach Cozart signs with the Angels, 3 years, $38 million. Wade Davis with the Rockies, 3 years, $52 million. The Rockies giving a lot of money to pitchers and a relief pitcher nonetheless. Todd Frazier with the Mets, 2 years, a $17 million deal. I think it's a good deal for the Mets. They need to solidify that third base situation. There's just been a mess with David Wright over the last couple of years. And then Carlos Santana, formerly of the Indians, signing with the Phillies. And he signed a 3-year, $60 million deal. All these deals are 2, 3, one's out of a 5-year deal. These are all guys in their early 30s. No one really breaking the bank or signing a huge long-term deal. Like Lorenzo Cain will be 36 when this deal is over, but the other guys, they're still going to be in their mid-30s. So there's been a lot of talk that the players' union and some agents are thinking there's some collusion going on amongst the owners. Why haven't we seen the likes of, Eric Hosmer, JD Martinez, and Mike Moustakas and these guys getting signed quicker? Why are we a week away from everyone reporting and there's still a lot of big name free agents out there? I don't necessarily believe it's a collusion thing as much as I think teams are trying to be more fiscally responsible. And I know that sounds crazy in a sport like baseball where people just throw money around left and right. But I think some of these teams are looking at what the Astros did and saying, hey, we can draft well. We can bring up some young talent. Look at a team like the Red Sox. They've got a lot of young talent that's still arbitration eligible. They have under team control. They have some missing pieces. They have some things they need to work on. But I think teams are looking at the Astros and saying, hey, look, we can tank. We can draft well. And we can try to build from within. We're not going to go out and give an aging pitcher a big deal and hope that it works out. So I think there's more teams that are being sensible about what they're doing. And it's not a collusion thing in my mind. I think the top tier teams like the Red Sox and the Yankees and the Dodgers are cognizant of that luxury tax right now. And so they're being careful about where they're going. They don't want to overpay for players. And I believe there's only a handful of teams that are willing to pay the big money. The Sox have offered JD Martinez a 5-year, $125 million deal. The offer's on the table. So it's not like some teams are colluding. Just because there's not another offer out there doesn't mean, there's collusion going on. It just means that the market doesn't feel JD Martinez is worth that. So either he's going to go back to Arizona for who knows what, or he's going to go to Boston. Maybe a third team swoops in. But the fact of the matter is the market's just not there for some of these players. And I think teams are figuring this out. And teams are starting to realize, hey, look, like the Mets. I can get a Todd Frazier for $8.5 a year. Todd Frazier is a serviceable player. He's going to do well. He's going to get some production for you, and he's not breaking the bank. And that's what I think teams are starting to look at and say, hey, look, when the Red Sox brought back Mitch Moreland on a short deal, 2-year deal, it wasn't overly expensive. That was a sign. That was a sign right there that they're like, we feel comfortable with what we have. We're willing to roll the dice with Mitch Moreland for another year. We're willing to see what Hanley Ramirez can bring to the table. And maybe these guys have an uptick in production. And I think you're seeing more teams go that route and saying, hey, look, we're comfortable with what we have in-house. We need in-house to produce a little better. How can that happen? And if we can round out with a Todd Frazier, with a Jay Bruce, with someone that we're going to get reasonably cheap for short money, they're going to do that. I've always been a big fan of overpaying for a shorter deal than signing someone to a 6-7 year deal and keeping your fingers crossed that you're going to get any production from these guys at the end of that. That usually doesn't work out well, and especially when we're pushing guys into their late 30s. More times than not, those deals fail miserably. So I don't think it's a collusion thing. I think it's teams that are just being a little more responsible. Again, like I said, it sounds crazy in the world of sports, but there's probably going to be a fury of activity here over as pitchers and catchers report tomorrow. Position players, a lot of them have already reported, but they're going to be in within the next week. You're going to start seeing some of these names come flying off, I'm sure, the free agent market. And maybe some of those guys are just going to re-sign with the team they were with before. But there doesn't appear to be a lot of suitors for these guys. So I think the JD Martinez thing probably will happen in the next couple of days, and we'll see. Does he just decide? I did hear this morning from Buster Olney that apparently like 20% of the free agents still on the market are Scott Boras clients. So that might have something to say with what's going on, and maybe the owners are kind of, I wouldn't say they're colluding and there's backdoor conversations, but maybe the owners are just looking at this and saying, man, we're tired of dealing with Boras and his antics. This is what we're going to pay. This is what we want. I mean, like I said, with JD Martinez, the deal's on the table. Everyone knows what it is. Don't say there's collusion because there's a deal. It's up to you to decide whether you want to take that $25 million a year and run with it, or you're going to keep your fingers crossed that someone else is going to come in. I mean, if you want to stay in Arizona and go back to Arizona for less money, great. But there's offers on the table. So we'll be monitoring the free agency over the next couple of days because, like I said, I assume over the next week or so, these names are going to start falling off the list and people are going to get in line. One of the big things historically with baseball has always been, who's that first person to set the bar? And I think right now a lot of people are hesitant to be that guy. Lorenzo Cain jumped in early. I don't think there was many other teams out there who were going to give Lorenzo Cain a 5-year, $80 million deal. Lorenzo Cain jumped in early because he had a good offer on the table. But other people, how does Darvish set the table for an Arrieta? Everyone's waiting for that first guy to go, and so then the dominoes tend to fall in place afterwards, and those numbers start to, work themselves out a little bit. So we'll be monitoring that. We'll see what's going on, and definitely when signings start to happen, we'll have an opinion and some thoughts on those. But to wrap up the free agency thing, Darvish again, I shake my head. Those long-term deals I don't think work out. Short-term might be good, but we'll see. So we'll be monitoring Major League Baseball free agency over the next week or so. Let's roll into basketball, sport that's heading into its All-Star break here next weekend. But the game of the weekend for me, and this is going to be a game I think we're going to look back on in a couple of months and say this was a big turning point in the season, is definitely the Cavs-Celtics game. The Cavs came out in Boston, 121-99, and I don't even think it was that close. I said last week after the trade deadline that I thought this was going to be a huge shift for the Cavs. They got younger, they got more athletic, they got better defensively. That showed yesterday. The big win last Wednesday with LeBron hitting the game winner, the buzzer beater. I said, okay, this could be it. This could be where LeBron starts to get a little momentum. They turn the corner. Then the trade deadline happens, and some of the dead weight, some of the older players, some of the friction got sent packing. And, they won Friday night in Atlanta. Kyle Korver had a 30-point game, short bench because they didn't have all the guys in. Then they go into Boston, and, LeBron goes down for a few minutes, comes back. But those new guys, Jordan Clarkson had 17, George Hill had 12, Rodney Hood had 15. They were energetic. They were athletic. LeBron looked younger. He looked interested. Osman in the starting lineup. Osman had 12. And that kid has had a couple good games here back to back. And this is a guy who's got 5 years of professional experience overseas, but he's only 21 years old. And, again, he brings that youthful enthusiasm, and you could see LeBron encouraging it. Osman had a missed dunk in the game. And LeBron's right there clapping, building him up. And I think these trades were huge. And I don't want to be a hot take guy and say, now this team now is, they're running away with the East. Because that's one of the things I despise about sports radio and these analysts is they'll come on one day and they'll say this is the best team in the world, and then they'll go on a 2-game losing streak and it'll be like, oh my gosh, this guy's falling, what's wrong? That's not what we're doing here. But I do believe that the Cavs are turning a corner. And this potentially could be two teams going in opposite directions. Now, I don't believe the Celtics are going to fall apart. But the Cavs have won 3 in a row. The Cavs appear to be accelerating while the Celtics appear to be struggling. and getting a little stagnant. And the All-Star break could not come at a better time for the Celtics. I think this is a team that needs some rest. They need a break. They've played a lot of games. They went overseas. They jumped out to an early blazing schedule and win-loss record right out of the gates. And I think they need time to recover. I think that in some levels, some of these guys have hit a wall. The Tatums, the Browns, some guys have overachieved. Some guys have played beyond what your expectation was. And so I think now there's a little regression to the mean there a little bit, and they need this All-Star break. And Brad Stevens needs to get with these guys, and they need to regroup. They're 5.5 games up on the Cavs right now. I will be very interested to see where these standings are 2 to 3 weeks, a month from now. Celtics are now a half game behind Toronto. Toronto's quietly putting together a great season. I think you're going to start to see the Cavs creep up. At the beginning of the year, I believe the Celtics were going to win the East, but I thought the Cavs were going to beat the Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals. I wouldn't be surprised, given these new players, that the Cavs make a strong run to win the East now, because that second unit yesterday looked comfortable. They had scoring options. They didn't look lost out there. And this means LeBron gets more rest. And if LeBron can get more rest, and this second unit can play productively, and even the first unit without LeBron, can play well, if he can cut his minutes down even just a few minutes a game and get that rest in for playoff time, that could be a recipe for disaster for the rest of the East. So, to me, that was a telling game. We won't know for a couple of months whether this was the turning point. I mean, it's hard to always pinpoint where that is in an 82-game season. But that was a big game where the Cavs came to conquer the Celtics. And it could be a deflating loss for the Celtics. Again, we'll see how they respond and how they react. This Cavaliers team, I'm impressed with what they did. I'm cautiously optimistic that they're going to start to put some things together and make a run. But LeBron now has players on the perimeter. There was one play there in the second half where LeBron's driving the lane and Clarkson is just spot up on the three, and LeBron just kind of turns in midair, kicks it out, and Clarkson drains it. And that's what LeBron looks for. LeBron needs those perimeter guys. And with Hood, Clarkson, Hill, Osman, Korver, they've got those guys that can drain the long-range shot. They have some athleticism inside now with Larry Nance. Jeff Green's always athletic. So they've got some pieces, and they're going to start to develop, and they're going to start to learn to play well with each other. And again, I think it's going to be very scary over the next couple of months. And, like always, we're going to monitor it. We're going to see how things go. Tides can change. But I think the Celtics need to figure something out. They need to figure out what they need to do, because when their shots weren't falling like yesterday, they got to slash, they got to drive, they got to do something else, because if they're not hitting, they're in trouble. So I do believe it's a 3-team race in the East. I think it's either going to be Toronto, Boston, or the Cavs at this point. I don't think Washington has the horses. I don't think they ever do. Miami definitely not. And then, the rest of the East. And the West is going to be interesting too. We'll talk more about that later this week as we roll into All-Star break, kind of reflect on some midseason, kind of make some predictions for the second half of the season. But it's been an interesting first half, and the Cavs in the trade deadline just made it that much more interesting. Before we wrap up today's episode, I just want to touch on it was Paul Pierce night. Paul Pierce's number was retired, deservedly so. I think Paul Pierce is a Hall of Famer. I think Paul Pierce was a great Celtic player. But I just want to touch on what Robert Parrish said. Paul Pierce was not the best offensive Celtic player ever. Paul Pierce was a scorer. A lot of times people don't understand the difference between a shooter and a scorer. Larry Bird was a shooter. Allen Iverson was a scorer. Allen Iverson was a pure scorer. That guy, he would drive, he could score, he could shoot from anywhere on the court. He didn't shoot at a great percentage. That's the difference. Bird is a shooter. But Bird did a lot of other things that Pierce didn't do. Bird passed a lot. Bird, potentially was a triple-double every night he was out on the court. Bird shot tremendous from three-point land in an era where there wasn't a lot of three-pointers. So I think Larry Bird is probably the best offensive player in the history of the Boston Celtics, not Paul Pierce. Paul Pierce is a top 10 Celtic for sure. He had a great career here. I'm glad they honored him last night. I'm glad they retired his number. It makes perfect sense. But with a lot of things, we lose the history. We forget how good certain people were. Pierce was a player in a different time, and he was a different type of player than Larry Bird. But Bird was still, in my mind, the best offensive player in Celtics history, if not the best player in Celtics history. And Paul Pierce, like I said, is right up there in top 10, possibly knocking on the top 5. He has some wonderful stats. But Pierce played on some really bad Celtics teams. And that's not Paul Pierce's fault. A lot of that's front office stuff. But he played on some really terrible teams. But it was great for the Celtics to acknowledge him. Unfortunately, they couldn't win the game last night. But I think it was nice to retire Paul's number. Give Paul that moment. We didn't have to worry about the Isaiah Thomas controversy, which was great. There's no video to deal with. But before wrapping up, I just wanted to say that not the best offensive player in Celtics history, but definitely one of the top players in Celtics history. And it was great to watch him. And that 2008 season was fantastic. With KG and Rondo. It was great to have those guys here and to bring another banner to the Garden and to New England and the Celtics fan. So that wraps up this episode. We'll be back at the end of the week. We'll be monitoring, like I said, the free agency stuff that's going on in Major League Baseball. We'll be watching the college game this week and see what's going on in college basketball, and obviously the couple games that are going on this week in the NBA before we get into All-Star weekend next weekend. We'll see if there's any happenings going on, and just, again, monitor what's out there, seeing who's getting hot, who's falling off. We'll be back probably on Friday of this week with some updates, and we'll talk to you then. Again, remember, push out this podcast, the YouTube channel, share it with friends, family, follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Go to the website, do whatever you can to promote this so more and more people can get access to the ManCaveMorons Podcast YouTube video. And thank you. Enjoy your week, everyone, and we'll be back later in the week.